All right, let's get started. Welcome again. So nice to see so many of you. Welcome back for week 5 out of 6, getting us from the Revolution through the Civil War and into Reconstruction. And so today, I'm going to talk about basically the decade leading up to the Civil War and the crisis, the national crisis that took place over the issue of slavery. And in order to talk about slavery, you have to talk about race. And in this country, if you talk about race, you find yourself talking about colors. But I would just like to point out that we are prisoners of our language. This is white. This is not. This is beige. This is some sort of beige pink mottled effect. This is not white. You're not white. We're all various shades of something else. Your hair may be white. I see some people. Very good examples. But the black people I've met are not pure black. Being in a totally dark room with no light is pure black. We're victims of our language. The language has obvious good and evil connotations to it in our culture. And that is one of many aspects of the tragedy that we're still dealing with 400 years after the first slaves were sold in Virginia. Okay, but I have to, what other language do you use? So I'm going to end up, I have been all through the class up till now, white and black is kind of a convenient shorthand, but it's not literally true. So let's just sort of remember that. Okay, so by 1860, there were nearly 4 million slaves in the country. There's a map showing the general regions where slaves were used for labor. You've got the purple up at the top is tobacco, so there's still some of that in Virginia and over in Kentucky. The green along the coast is a little bit of rice grown in the shore area. The orange down in Louisiana is sugar, and then, of course, the big red blotch is cotton. Cotton represented half of the value of all of American exports in 1860. That region is producing an immense amount of cotton, enough to keep the textile mills in New England going, and also keeping many, if not most, of the textile mills in Great Britain in operation. Slavery is a way of life down there. This is a map showing some areas had more slaves than others. The dark red on the map, slaves are more than 50% of the population in the dark red areas. Less than 10%, the light yellow, or up in Missouri and some parts of the Appalachians. It is not at all the case that every white person down in the South owned slaves. 3/4 of the white families did not have any slave. They're just working family farms like people in the North, people in the Midwest. And only about less than 7% of white men owned more than 10 slaves. So as a head count, plantations are fairly rare. Politically, the plantation owners are the richest and the most powerful. And there are, of course, some plantations with hundreds of slaves. Now, these numbers don't tell the story, really. We're talking about some people owning other people, right? Those people are property down in the South. Those people are property, and those little kids are helping to pick the cotton. Those people are property. Again, human beings forced to work in the cotton fields. People could be bought and sold, and owners could break up slave families anytime they wanted. On the internet, you can find these auction posters. Poster on the left, if you can read it, notice the terminology. The slaves are bucks, wenches, and pickaninnies. That's a little child. One mother is being sold with her 6-month-old child. So the chances are that the father is either or had already been sold or was being left behind. And the poster on the right is the first. I don't know if you can. Now it's in the fine print, I suppose, but all of the slaves are fully guaranteed. It's like, guaranteed or your money back. Property. Owners could do anything they wanted to punish their slaves. In theory, there was a code that said you can't go too far, but that code was not enforced. And that gentleman is named Peter. It's maybe one of the most famous photographs from the Civil War era. Peter was a slave who escaped from a Louisiana plantation in 1863. And he and 2 companions traveled for 10 days trying to get to the Union lines. And they rubbed, I never knew this until today, they rubbed themselves with onions to throw off the bloodhounds that the slave catchers were using, and apparently that works. They made it, and that photo was taken by an Army doctor in the Union Army in 1863. He apparently nearly died from the whipping. All right, so opposition to slavery did gradually grow in the North in the 1840s. And Southerners developed a couple of lines of defense. I mean, how do you defend that? Well, one line of defense was that slavery is perfectly natural and supports civilization. That fellow in the upper left there is a senator from South Carolina named Hammond, and he wrote, he gave a speech in Congress in 1858. In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. Such a class you must have, or you would not have that other class, which leads to progress, civilization, and refinement. George Fitzhugh was one of the most prolific pro-slavery writers of the 50s. That's him on the right there. He wrote that slavery is the natural and normal condition of society. And they had plenty of precedents from the Bible to back them up, right? I mean, people are slaves in the Bible, in the Old Testament. So that helped them to argue to themselves, at least, that people have always had slaves. Ancient Greece had slaves. Rome had slaves. It supports the right kind of society. Now, a second argument, which is kind of interesting, is that actually we treat our slaves better than you treat your workers up north. You've got factories growing in the north and a lot of people working for very little money in tough factory conditions. And Hammond, in that same speech, said, your whole hireling class of manual laborers are essentially slaves. The difference between us is that our slaves are hired for life and well compensated. Yours are hired by the day, not cared for, and scantily compensated. Fitzhugh, same theme. Capital exercises a more perfect compulsion over free laborers than human masters over slaves. For free laborers must at all times work or starve, and slaves are supported whether they work or not. Which is, on one level, that was kind of true, because if a slave turned 60, then couldn't work in the fields anymore, they tended, as long as they might still live, they tended to stay on the plantation. It was another rationalization. And I think it's kind of ironic, but Karl Marx would have agreed with those guys about factory labor in the North, that people, the proletariat are wage slaves who have to work or starve. I'm sure they would never have thought of that similarity. Okay, so what forces the issue on slavery? Here's the United States in 1850. After the Mexican-American War, you've got, beside the states, which are in green, you've got several territories, and maybe you can read the labels, but just to help out, there's a Minnesota territory up by the Great Lakes that's not yet a state. There's Indian territory that runs from Oklahoma, which is in yellow, all the way up to the Canadian border. That was not organized territory, and for the time being, the American Indian tribes were being left alone out there. Then there was Oregon territory in the upper northwest, and then the whole regions taken from Mexico. This particular map also shows a little picture of Alaska, but you can ignore that for the time being. We hadn't bought Alaska yet. Now, what happens? We know where slavery is already in existence or prohibited, but what happens to all those orange areas? Can slavery spread into all of them? That was the big controversial question. And in 1848, there were 4 basic positions on how you would do it. You could extend the Missouri Compromise line. So if you look where Missouri is, the bottom border of Missouri, run that line all the way to the Pacific. If you stuck with the Missouri Compromise, that line would prevail. North, free. Below the line, south would be slave. Some Northern Democrats were coming around to the idea of what they called popular sovereignty, which is, Congress doesn't need to sort this out. We'll just let the people who settle there decide what they want. It has a certain democratic quality to it. And then you have 2 extreme positions. The South, of course, says that Congress has no ability and settlers have no ability to prevent slavery anywhere in that orange area. And you have a new political party, the Free Soil Party, that takes exactly the opposite position and says Congress could prohibit slavery anywhere in that orange section. So there's an election in 1848, right after the war with Mexico. The Democrats pick Senator Lewis Cass, that's him on the left. The Whigs, having run an actual candidate with an actual program in 1844 and losing, they go back to their strategy of a military hero. So the guy in the middle there is Zachary Taylor, who was front page news because of his victories in Mexico just the previous year. And the Free Soil Party picked Martin Van Buren, the former president. Taylor got the most popular votes. Taylor and Cass won the same number of free states and slave states, so that map looks fairly balanced. What makes the difference was Van Buren. His third part, and we've seen this pattern in more recent history. Can you spell Ralph Nader in 2000? Sometimes third parties siphon off enough votes to swing the election. And in this case, it was Van Buren. He got more than 10% of the popular vote, and he took enough votes away from Cass so that Zachary Taylor won New York, and just winning New York was the difference. Now, Polk had thought that national expansion, which Polk advocated, would somehow reduce the national conflict over slavery. Many people disagreed. One of them was Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote at the same time, "The United States will conquer Mexico, but it will be like the man who swallows the arsenic, which brings him down in turn. Mexico will poison us." And the problem of sorting out what to do with the new territory did indeed poison us. So, what forces the issue next is that California grew so fast because of the gold rush the year before. California is already ready to be a state. So they come knocking, they want to come in, and at that point there were 13 slave states and 13 free states. California is going to tip the balance. And that leads in the spring of 1850 to one of the most legendary series of speeches in the U.S. Senate that there have ever been. And back in the 19th century, school kids memorized some of them, not the sort of thing that would happen today. So who's there? Who's on the floor of the Senate? The man on the left is Henry Clay, who's been a power in politics for pretty much nearly 40 years at this point, has already lost the presidency 3 times. He is known for putting together compromises, and he had done it on many occasions on different issues. And he warned the Senate that without a compromise on this issue, there will be a civil war so furious, so bloody, so implacable, and so exterminating that its memory will last forever. He got that right. Now, the man on the right is John Calhoun from South Carolina. He is the advocate of total freedom to bring your slaves anywhere you want. He's, you know, the Southerners are now playing the secession card, the disunion card. And so Calhoun says that the admission of California would destroy the equilibrium between the regions, and then nothing would be left to hold the states together but force. He wanted a constitutional amendment to make clear that you could have a slave anywhere in the U.S. states or territories. Now, the other 2 stalwart figures in this debate are Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster on the left. He is a Whig, he's from Massachusetts, but he cares nothing about the moral issues involving slavery. He is perfectly happy to let the South do whatever it wants to keep doing as long as the Union stays together. And he began his speech by saying, "I wish to speak today not as a Massachusetts man, not as a Northern man, but as an American. I speak today for the preservation of the Union." And his message was, he basically told the Northerners, don't worry about it. Slavery's not that important. It's not going to spread into those areas because the climate won't let it. And he basically told the Southerners, calm down. Secession, as he put it, would wreck the universe. So he's just trying to calm the waters. And then the fellow on the right is a Whig named William Seward from New York State. And he says, there is a higher law than the Constitution. The issue is whether the Union will stand with slavery or without it. And if the Union does not stand, the Union will be dissolved, civil war will ensue, and it will bring on violent but complete and immediate emancipation. That's his warning to the South. If you actually get yourselves into a war, you're going to lose all your slaves, and it'll happen fast. That was his theory. As I said, school kids used to memorize these. Mostly it was Webster. I speak for the Union. That was something that kids were reciting for the rest of the 19th century. Now, I mentioned last week that the Whigs were unlucky, and their first president died after a month. They're unlucky again. Zachary Taylor managed to survive for 2 years, but he died unexpectedly in July 1850 while all these debates in Congress are going on. And so his vice president, Millard Fillmore, from Buffalo, becomes president. Taylor was kind of playing a complicated game about how to solve the issue of California. Fillmore simply threw his support behind Henry Clay's compromise. And that ended up working. And so what is the compromise of 1850? California gets to come in as a free state. The compromise drew a boundary between Texas and New Mexico. It was very unclear where Texas ended and the rest of what used to be Mexican territory began. The settlers of New Mexico and Utah territories could decide for themselves whether they wanted slavery. As a sop to the anti-slavery folks, the compromise prohibited the slave trade in Washington, D.C. It didn't prohibit owning slaves, but you had to buy them someplace else. I guess Maryland or Virginia. And it also included a tougher Fugitive Slave Act. You get to 1852, here are the candidates. These things are starting to unravel politically. It took the Whigs 53 ballots at their convention before they picked another war hero. That's General Winfield Scott there on the right. It took the Democrats 49 ballots to pick Franklin Pierce, who's from New Hampshire, who was a Mexican War veteran, and like Daniel Webster, he was perfectly fine with slavery. He was not going to try to upset anything in any way. I have to point out that they've both got their hands in their jackets, and I do not know why. I think somebody in one of the earlier slides was doing that. Napoleon, did he set a trend? 60 years after Napoleon, practically, they're still doing it? I don't know. The Whig Party is starting to come apart, and Franklin Pierce and the Democrats win easily. Now, both of the parties in 1852 endorsed the Compromise of 1850. So if both parties are on record as saying, we think that was a good thing, you might have thought that the tension over slavery would calm down, but it did not. One reason it didn't is because that tougher Fugitive Slave Act stirred up anti-slavery in the North. Many slaves tried to run away, and as you can see, there are rewards being offered for them. But the poster on the right is put up in Boston, and it's to warn free blacks in Boston to look out for kidnappers. Because the slave catchers weren't necessarily too concerned about whether the black person they grabbed was an actual slave or not. So one of the most famous people who succeeded in running away is Harriet Tubman. And that's the actual, that's her on the left, of course. That's the actual wanted poster for her. She is referred to as Minty in the middle of that wanted poster. She's aged about 27 and apparently was about 5 feet high. And that little person who escaped went back. First, she went back to get her immediate family. Then she went back to get her 70-year-old parents. She went back 19 times and managed to lead 300 slaves to freedom. And as she put it, I had a right to liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other, for no man should take me alive. And there were some whites in the North who tried to help, and there really was, the Underground Railroad is not a myth. There really were routes that escaped slaves tried to follow to get them up across the Mason-Dixon line. Because of the slave catchers, some slaves were helped all the way to Canada, make it harder to find them. And northern crowds often interfered with the recapture of a slave. Somebody gets picked up by a slave catcher in downtown Boston, a crowd assembles and basically forces the slave catcher to release the person for fear of being beaten up or worse. So crowds were helping protect the fugitive slaves, and state governments up here decided to do nothing to help the recapture. So the only way you could get your slave back was you go to federal court and get some federal officer to help you, and there weren't very many of them. It's estimated that 15,000 slaves escaped in the 1850s, and that only about 300 were caught. Now, the next major event in the early 50s here, after the election of 52, is Harriet Beecher Stowe's bestseller, Uncle Tom's Cabin. She was the daughter of Lyman Beecher, who was a prominent minister and the president of a theological seminary. She married a professor of biblical literature at Bowdoin, up in Brunswick. They sheltered runaway slaves in their home in Brunswick, which is what that photo on the bottom left is. You can still visit it. And her goal in the book was to illustrate the human cost of slavery, and her descriptions were melodramatic and very, very vivid. It first came out in weekly installments. When it came time for the printer to release a consolidated book edition, the printer didn't know if it would sell. He ordered an initial run of 5,000 copies. It sold 300,000 copies. I mean, bestseller, unprecedented level of sales. So the things I've just been talking about are stirring up anti-slavery sentiment in the North. This book, everybody was reading this book. And then Senator Stephen Douglas from Illinois decides to truly mess things up by changing the rules. In 1854, he proposed a bill that would organize the Kansas and Nebraska territories. One of his main reasons is he wanted them to be organized so that it would be easier to plan and then build a railroad from Chicago, in his district, out to the Pacific. Now, he proposes that the settlers in those two regions decide for themselves whether they want slavery, and that the law completely repeals that line, the Missouri Compromise line, and now the rules are quite different. The rules are whoever gets there and can get control of the territorial government can decide whether there will be slavery or not, and the shooting is going to start now. There was a race to get people into Kansas. Those folks are from the North. Churches raised money to send people to Kansas and also to buy Bibles. Buy guns, which were referred to as Beecher's Bibles, because Reverend Beecher was a prominent fundraiser for the guns. And they're heading to Kansas to try to prevent slavery. Those folks are all going to Kansas to defend slavery. Most of them came over from Missouri. And the result was what is known in the history books as Bleeding Kansas. Actually, it got that title fairly early. The different groups attacked each other. There was a pro-slavery group that destroyed 2 anti-slavery newspapers and burned down pretty much all of Lawrence, Kansas. And then, in the most famous incident as part of Bleeding Kansas, John Brown, up there on the right, he and some buddies go to a place called Pottawatomie, and they slaughter 5 anti-slavery men using broadswords. They hacked them to death. I don't know where you get the broadswords, but that event is the one that has lasted in people's memory. But there were a total of about 55 people killed in this Bleeding Kansas period for a couple of years. And while the fighting is going on in Kansas, the fighting is also going on in the halls of Congress. So in 1856, while the Senate was debating what to do with Kansas, Senator Charles Sumner, there on the left from Massachusetts, denounced what he called the crime against Kansas. And it was an era of flowery and melodramatic language, and Sumner was one of the best. And so as part of his speech, he said things like this: "It is the rape of a virgin territory, compelling it to the hateful embrace of slavery. And it may be clearly traced to a depraved desire for a new slave state." One of the sponsors of the Kansas bill that would have protected slavery was a South Carolina senator named Andrew Butler. And Sumner, in his speech, says that Senator Butler has chosen a mistress to whom he has made his vows. I mean the harlot, slavery. Tough stuff. Well, his cousin Preston was a member of the House of Representatives, and Preston, there on the right, decided to defend the family honor by sneaking up on Sumner while he was at his desk in the Senate and beating him with a cane to the point that Sumner didn't get back to the Senate for 3 years. The Northern press, of course, was outraged. The Southern press was ecstatic. This is From the Richmond Enquirer, one of the leading papers in the South at the time, the deed was good in conception, better in execution, and best of all in consequences. The vulgar abolitionists in the Senate are getting above themselves. They must be lashed into submission. As the tensions continue to rise, the political party structure, Whigs versus Democrats, unravels, and there are two new political parties. One of them was a party that hated immigrants. All right, we have a tradition of parties that don't like immigrants. The Native American Party, and remember I mentioned last week that about 3 million Irish and Germans came to America between 1845 and 1855. Most of them were Catholic, and there were an awful lot of Protestants in the North and some in the South who were so anti-Catholic that they formed a new political party to try to control the influence of the Catholic Church. The members, this is so weird, they met secretly, this new party, and the members were told to say nothing, say, I know nothing, if anyone asks you about what happens at the meetings. And so somehow that I know nothing became their nickname. And although they called themselves the American Party, they're the know-nothings in American history. They are, as you can't probably read that newspaper of theirs, but they're opposed to papal aggression and Roman Catholicism and being taxed for the support of foreign paupers, whatever that means. They also advocated temperance because they believed these immigrants abused alcohol rather badly. And they wanted a 21-year period before someone could become a naturalized citizen. The other new party is the Republican Party. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854, a lot of new anti-slavery groups formed across the North. And they used various names for themselves. Some simply called themselves Anti-Nebraska. Some called themselves People's Party. But the name that emerged for this new group of anti-slavery folks was Republican, and that term was first used at a little convention, a little meeting in Ripon, Wisconsin. And that's the building where they met. And the folks in Ripon are proud to say that that is where the Republican Party was born. And technically, if the name is what matters, then yes, it was. Within just a year or two, the Republicans are attracting a whole range of folks who are opposed to slavery. Some of them had been Whigs, some of them had been Free Soilers, and some of them had been Democrats. And you can see how quickly it happened. This is the election for the House in 1854. Already, the Republicans come in with 13 members. They've only been in existence for a few months. And you can see that the Whigs are shrinking. And in that particular election, the backlash against the Kansas-Nebraska Act was so powerful in the North that 2/3 of the Democrats up here lost their seats. That's why you can see it just plummets. At this point, the Democrats are really just a Southern party controlled by Southern slave owners, with a few Northerners who are always willing to compromise. You get to the election of 1856, the Democrats pick James Buchanan, who had been a senator from Pennsylvania and the Secretary of State. They endorsed popular sovereignty, states' rights, and their main theme was the Republicans, if you elect Republicans, they are going to tear the country apart because they are only in the North and they're so opposed to the South, the country will split. The Republicans picked that youngish fellow in the center there, former General John C. Fremont. Their slogan, who had explored the Rockies and also been on the liberation force of the California settlers in the Mexican War. Their party's slogan was free soil, free labor, free speech, free men, and Fremont. You could put that on a bumper sticker. Their position was that Congress has the power to prevent slavery anywhere in the territories. The Know-Nothings, or the American Party, picked ex-President Fillmore. And it was pretty obvious to most people that Buchanan was the only candidate who could keep the country together at that point. You can see this is the first map I've shown you, I think, since back with the Federalists, where there's such an obvious geographical difference between the parties. Fremont won 11 of the 16 free states. Buchanan carried all of the southern states plus 5 of the free states, and Fillmore won Maryland. After this election, what's happening in the House? The Republicans, in just 2 years, are now the second largest party by quite a lot. And the Whigs have disappeared. They've gone up in smoke. The next big step on the road to war involves this gentleman, Dred Scott. He was a slave. I don't know how well you'll be able to spot on the map. I could not figure out how to tinker with it to make the red dots more visible, but it shows the different places he lived. He was born in Virginia. At some point, his owner took him to Alabama, then up to Missouri. When he was around age 33, he was sold to an Army doctor named John Emerson. Emerson took him to Fort Armstrong in Illinois, and then took him all the way up to Fort Snelling up in the Wisconsin territory. That particular part is now part of Minnesota, but back then it was Wisconsin territory. While he's in Wisconsin, Scott marries Harriet Robinson. They have 4 children. 2 of them died in infancy, but the other 2 survived. And next, Dr. Emerson brings them all back to Missouri, to St. Louis. Emerson dies. His wife, Irene, inherits Scott and the family. In 1846, Scott sued her for assault and false imprisonment under Missouri state law. An abolitionist minister in St. Louis found him a lawyer so that he could do that, and he won his case in 1850 because at that time, Missouri law was once free, always free, was the slogan, which meant someone like Scott, who's been taken up to Wisconsin, which is free territory, is now free for life, at least in Missouri. And so under Missouri law at that time, Scott wins. 2 years later, the Missouri Supreme Court decides to change the rules. Once a slave, always a slave. It reverses the verdict in Scott's favor. Irene Emerson decides to move to Massachusetts. She gives Scott to her brother, John Sanford. Scott was a persistent guy. And in 1853, he sued Mr. Sanford for assault. A jury ruled against him because now under Missouri law, he wasn't a free person. And a prominent anti-slavery attorney took his appeal all the way to the Supreme Court. At the time, the Chief Justice was Roger Taney, there on the left. He's from Maryland. He had been appointed by Andrew Jackson. Taney was not a totally ardent slave owner. In fact, he emancipated the slaves that he inherited. But he believed that slavery was essential for the survival of the South as a society and an economy. And so he was a definite defender of the institution. So the case gets to the Supreme Court, and in December 1856, a majority of the justices decide against Scott on the grounds that he's still a slave under Missouri law. A very simple reason for resolving the case. And Samuel Nelson there, he was from New York, he starts drafting a very short, simple opinion that would just rule on the state law issue. If that opinion had come out, no one would remember this case. But while he was writing, the Southern majority on the court decided that maybe they could use this as an opportunity to resolve the slavery question once and for all in their favor. The mastermind behind that was apparently James Wayne on the left there. He was a justice from Georgia. And he persuaded Taney, and this is his direct quote, Wayne's quote, that the court could put an end to all further agitation on the subject of slavery in the territories, with a bigger opinion that covers that issue. So the Southerners want that, but of course it wouldn't look great if the Northerners were on one side and the Southerners were on another. So one of the justices lobbies President Buchanan, who was from Pennsylvania, and Buchanan lobbies Robert Greer, who is also from Pennsylvania, and urges him to join the opinion that Taney is writing. And Greer agrees. And he told Taney that he was anxious that it should not appear that a line of latitude marked a line of division within the court. Now, in March of 1857, Buchanan is getting sworn in as president, and during his inaugural speech, he says that the question of slavery in the territories is a judicial question which legitimately belongs to the Supreme Court, before whom it is now pending, and will, it is understood, be speedily and finally settled. To their decision, in common with all good citizens, I shall cheerfully submit, whatever this may be. Now, in fact, Buchanan was cheerful because they tipped him off. And 2 days later, the decision comes out. There are only two dissenters, John McLean from Ohio on the left, and Benjamin Curtis from Massachusetts on the right. So in a 7-2 decision, what did the Supreme Court say? Well, one of their three grounds for the opinion was the initial one, that simply, under Missouri law, Scott is still a slave. But then they go further. The second ground for their opinion was the federal court didn't even have jurisdiction over this case, because jurisdiction requires, in this situation, diversity of citizenship, right? To get into federal court, a federal court can handle a case between a citizen of one state and a citizen of another state. But that doesn't count here because black people can't be citizens. Taney wrote an in-depth historical opinion in which he tried to show that black people had never been treated as citizens at any time in the country's history. He had some pretty good examples of prejudice among the founding fathers of the North, but the idea that blacks had never been treated as citizens was just flat out wrong. Black people had voted in the early years of the country in several states. Black people had served in the Revolutionary Army. In many ways, and Curtis laid this out in his dissent, black people, of course, they've been citizens. But Taney's conclusion from this was that a black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. Now, if, in theory, if you take that as the actual reasoning, once the court says, hey, we don't have jurisdiction, they should close the book on it and just send the case away because they can't touch it. But no, they had a third reason why Scott loses. And this is the big ticket item for the Southerners. The Missouri Compromise itself was unconstitutional because Congress has no power to prohibit slavery anywhere in the territories. The constitutional argument that Taney made was completely wrong. Curtis, again, spelled that out in his dissent. On one level, though, Taney did make an interesting argument. It's the first time this clause had been used for this purpose. He said that if you prevent a slave owner from taking their slaves into the territories, you are depriving them of their property without due process. Yeah. The concept of depriving somebody of life or liberty or property without due process ends up being, whole courses on constitutional law. And on one level, you can trace it back to Taney. Now, the Southerners, plus their two Northern collaborators, thought that their decision would resolve the issue. You know, it's clear now that Congress can't do anything about slavery in the territories. Northerners went ballistic about this decision. One New York preacher said, "If the people obey this decision, they disobey God." The political divide between the North and the South grows rapidly, even more after this decision. I should have put that up before so that you could have followed along in my explanation. I'm sorry. But those are the three grounds that I was just talking about. In the next election, you can see the split growing. Pretty much every Northerner who opposes slavery is now voting Republican. The North has more people, and there it has more seats in the House of Representatives. And the Democrats are shrinking to the point that they're really just a Southern party. The Whigs are already gone, although a couple people decided to use the name again. The Free Soil Party is gone. The Know-Nothings are essentially gone. One feature of the election of 1858 was the Senate race in Illinois, which is certainly one of the more famous episodes in the march toward the Civil War. It's Lincoln and Stephen Douglas running against each other for the U.S. Senate. They debated up and down the state of Illinois. The debates were if you read the transcripts, and there are some pretty much word for word, you know, they were smart, and they talked about the issues, and they did not insult each other. It was possible, and might still be possible, to do that. Now, it's important to understand something. By the standards of his day, Lincoln was a liberal on the subject of race. He opposed slavery, and he believed black people should have equal economic equality, should be free, you know, to have their own farms, support themselves any way they want without interference. He was not a 20th or 21st century liberal on the subject of race. During one of the debates, Douglas declared, "I hold that this government was established for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever, and should be administered by white men and none others." Now, that puts Lincoln on the spot a bit, because whites in the North were still quite racist. They might hate slavery, but they are not. Whites in the North were not believers in true equality. So here's how Lincoln responded to what Douglas had said to him. "I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and the black races. I am not in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry." The intermarry card is really volatile for white people. And then Lincoln continued, "There is a physical difference between the two races that would probably forever forbid their living together upon a footing of perfect equality." You know, he was good for his times, but his times are quite different from where we are today. And sometimes the idolization of Lincoln misses some aspects of what he actually thought. Lincoln, of course, loses the election, but the debates get a lot of national press attention, and so Lincoln becomes a political figure with some national following. The next big event on the road to disaster, John Brown decides to take his act out of Kansas and bring it to Virginia. And in October 1859, John Brown and 21 of his followers attacked the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. That's an actual photo of what it looked like on the upper right, and the building at the bottom is the only building that's still there today from what Brown's time. There was only one guard on duty at the arsenal, so Brown and his people quite easily take over. He was hoping to collect a lot of weapons and trigger a slave uprising. He had asked Frederick Douglass, the nation's best-known black abolitionist, to join him on this venture, and Douglass said no because he thought the plan was suicide, which it was. Very quickly, federal troops led by Colonel Robert E. Lee surround the armory. That's an engraving of them storming the building. 10 of the raiders were killed on the spot. 7 were captured and executed, and 5 of them escaped. In December 2nd, 1859, Brown was hung for insurrection and murder. Now, depending on your perspective, the guy is either a terrorist or a freedom fighter, right? It kind of, depends on where you come from. The Northern response was really quite remarkable. There were some Northerners denounced him for using violence, but there were lots of expressions of sympathy for him. There's an engraving of him going to the gallows. The treason poster on the lower left says that Brown is to be hung next week for righteousness' sake and for doing justice to his fellow man. And the meeting poster on the right says in the fine print, the heroic apostle of freedom suffers martyrdom on a Virginia gallows today. Henry David Thoreau, who was an advocate of civil disobedience, called Brown, direct quote, an angel of light. Emerson, direct quote, said that Brown's death would, quote, make the gallows as glorious as the cross. John Brown in the same sentence with Jesus Christ? What? But on the day of the execution, across the North, church bells rang, crowds gathered, guns were fired in his honor, and it was the Northern reaction that troubled Southerners much more than the event itself. The Richmond Enquirer said that the Harper's Ferry invasion and the Northern response has advanced the cause of disunion more than any other event that has happened since the formation of a government. But what really triggers the secession is, of course, the election of 1860. Now, the Republicans had a convention in Chicago, which happened to be Lincoln's home turf. The best-known candidates going into the convention did not include Lincoln. You've got William Seward from New York, Salmon P. Chase, who was governor of Ohio, he's in the middle, and a former congressman from Missouri named Edward Bates. But going into the convention, or I should say, when the delegates got there, it turned out each one of those guys, yes, they had a following, but they'd also really antagonized other members of the party. Each of them had lots of enemies within the party. And Lincoln and his friends lobbied the group, trying to make sure that Lincoln was everybody's second choice. And when these three deadlocked, that's what happened. Lincoln won on the third ballot. There he is in 1860. That's a campaign poster. His vice president candidate was Hannibal Hamlin from Maine. Their platform was intended to be moderate. No slavery in the territories, but no federal interference with slavery in the South. The Southerners, the Democrats, when they get to their convention, Stephen Douglas on the left there, he really, really wants the nomination. But Southerners have come to not trust him as being strong enough against slavery. It took, after 57 ballots at their convention in Charleston, they're still deadlocked, everybody goes home. They reconvene in Baltimore, and when they're still deadlocked, the delegates from the lower South just walk out. The folks who are left nominate Douglas. The fellows who walked out got together in Richmond and picked John C. Breckinridge there from Kentucky, who was currently the vice president. So you have two Democrats running, Douglas and Breckinridge. And there's Lincoln, and then there's a fourth candidate. Some Southerners who were afraid of secession formed their own party called the Constitutional Union Party and picked that fellow, John Bell, who had once been a U.S. Senator. They basically dodged the issue of slavery and just emphasized we need to keep the country together. Now, the election was two completely different races. In the North, you have Lincoln versus Douglas. In the South, you have Bell versus Breckinridge. In the North, Lincoln wins every single state. In the South, Breckinridge is the dark green there. He won in the Deep South. Bell and Breckinridge kind of split the border states, but that is a pretty clear geographical pattern. Douglas got 30% of the popular vote, but it was fragmented, and he only got electoral votes from 2 states. So Lincoln easily wins the electoral vote. Now, the regions, by this point in 1860, the 2 regions really had very unrealistic views of each other. The Southerners were convinced that Lincoln and the Republicans were out to destroy slavery entirely, everywhere in the country. And that wasn't the Republican platform. That wasn't their plan. But Southerners were convinced that the Republicans were plotting a way to get rid of slavery entirely. On the Northerners, on the other hand, the general view was, those folks down there have been talking about secession. Ooh, they can't pronounce it, but they can talk about it. Secession. I can't get that out. You know the word. Okay. Oh, that's weird. They've been talking about that for 30 years. They haven't done it. They're just bluffing. They don't really mean it. But this time they were most definitely not bluffing. Right after the election, there's a convention in South Carolina that votes to secede. Within 6 weeks, there are conventions in the other 6 states in the Deep South. They all vote to secede, and the margin of victory was 80% in those conventions. Delegates gathered in early 1861 to create the Confederate States of America, and they chose Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis as their president. That all happens before Lincoln gets up to the podium to take the oath of office. And in his inaugural address, he tried to calm things down. He promised that the federal government was not going to interfere with slavery where it already existed, and he reached out to the Southerners with, the guy could write. He had a real gift for turning a phrase. And so I put up there a couple of the best closing lines. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. I mean, how could he have thought of this one? The mystic chords of memory will yet swell the chorus of the Union someday in the future, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. That's lovely. That's good stuff. It had absolutely no impact on the South. Absolutely none. Now, one of the obvious initial questions to face is the federal government has property down in the South, forts mostly along the coast. And what's going to happen to those forts? The Confederacy immediately tried to take possession of the forts. The question for Lincoln was, do you do anything to try to stop them? At his first cabinet meeting, only one member of Lincoln's cabinet thought he should try to hold on to the forts. Everybody else was ready to give in. But Lincoln said no, and he ordered the resupply of the forts, and the most endangered one was Fort Sumter, which sits in the middle of Charleston Harbor. The picture on the lower left there is an actual view of it from the southern edge of Charleston. I've been there. It seems like it's really far away, and I just can't imagine how anybody could hit it with a cannon. But they had lots of cannons, as that map shows, and they decided to attack, the Confederates decided to attack before the resupply ships could arrive. On April 12th, 1861, the cannon opened fire from all directions, and 2 days later, the fort surrendered, and that is a Confederate flag flying over the fort. Immediately after that, Virginia and 3 or more of the border states seceded, and you now have a nation that definitely includes the states in white on that map. The Confederates think they also have Kentucky, Missouri, and New Mexico territory, but actually they never had control in those sections. There weren't very many slave owners. Not enough, certainly. Okay, so here we are. We've now got a new nation. And it's time to wrap up today. And abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison once called the Constitution a covenant with death and an agreement with hell because it protected slavery. And he was kind of right. As we'll talk about some next week, it took 5 years of lots of deaths and real hell before the country could be pulled back together when the North eventually won the war. And so I'll just leave you with one last comment. Since I started giving these talks, from time to time, people ask me, do I think that the nation now is more divided socially and politically than it's ever been? And I say no, because to me, the only exception is the 1850s. In the 1850s, the country was truly splitting into 2 armed camps. One side was talking seriously about leaving the Union, and then does, and lots of people start shooting at each other. Now, here's an optimistic thought. We haven't gotten that bad yet. Who knows what 2024 is going to bring? So enough of that. I'll see you next week for the last class, and thank you all for being here.